It took Ethan Carter exactly 5 seconds to make the decision that would unravel everything he had spent a decade building. He looked up from his phone, glanced at his assistant, standing in the doorway with a tablet in her hands, and said the words without a trace of hesitation in his voice. "Remove my wife's name from the guest list." There was no anger in the way he said it, no cruelty, only the flat certainty of a man rearranging furniture in a room he believed belonged entirely to him. He did not want the billionaires, the fund managers, the men who controlled markets with a single phone call, to look at the woman standing beside him and wonder why she was there. He had convinced himself, quietly and over many years, that she did not belong in the room where his future would be decided. And so, with a single sentence spoken in the space of a breath, he erased her. But the night of the gala, as the orchestra tuned its instruments, and the crystal chandeliers threw their light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the ballroom doors opened. The woman he had just crossed off his own life stepped through them, wearing a black dress so simple it silenced the room before she said a single word. There was no jewelry catching the light, no entourage trailing behind her, nothing that announced wealth the way the other women in that room announced it. And yet the moment she crossed the threshold, conversation folded in on itself and disappeared. One by one, the most powerful people in that building rose to their feet, not for Ethan, for her, and for a truth about to unfold that no one in that room, least of all her husband, had seen coming. New York wore autumn well that year, the kind of cold that arrived gently, dressing the avenues in amber and rust before the first true frost settled over the city. It was the season for galas, for charity dinners held in ballrooms with ceilings painted 3 centuries ago somewhere in Europe, and shipped across an ocean for men who wanted to be remembered, as generous long after their balance sheets were forgotten. This particular evening belonged to the largest financial gala of the year, a night where old money and new money learned to shake hands, where careers were made in the space of a single toast, and where a woman's dress could say more about. Ethan Carter was 39 years old, and he stood at the exact center of that world, the chief executive of an investment firm preparing for its public offering, a man whose ambition had long since outgrown every room he had ever walked into. He was sharp, disciplined, relentlessly organized, and obsessed with the way things appeared from the outside, because he had learned early in his career that in his world, appearance was often mistaken for substance, and he had built his entire reputation on making certain no one looked too closely at the difference. His wife was nothing like the women who usually stood beside men like him at these events. Amara Johnson Carter was 37, a black American woman with a quiet elegance that never announced itself, the kind of presence that made a room feel calmer rather than louder the moment she entered it. She was thoughtful in a way that unsettled people who mistook her silence for something smaller than it actually was. She avoided cameras, avoided interviews, avoided the small talk that came with photographers stationed near the entrance of every charity dinner, and for years Ethan had assumed this was simply shyness, something to be managed rather than something to be understood. They had been married for 8 years, and in the very beginning, he had loved her precisely because she was unlike anyone else in his orbit, because she asked nothing of his money and everything of his character. Success, however, has a way of rewriting a man's memory, and the higher Ethan climbed, the more he began to see his wife not as the woman who had shaped him into the man he had become, but as a variable that no longer fit neatly into the equation of the life he now believed he deserved. It began, as most quiet betrayals do, in small and forgettable moments. A business partner would ask, almost in passing, where his wife had been at the last dinner, and Ethan would answer with practiced ease that she preferred to stay out of the spotlight. He said it so often that it began to sound true even to himself, though the truth underneath it was far less flattering. He did not want to take her. He had started to see Amara's calm reserve, the very quality that had once made him fall in love with her in a cramped apartment years earlier, as something that made him look smaller in rooms where he needed to appear larger than life. He never said this aloud, not even to himself in the privacy of his own reflection, but it lived inside him nonetheless, in the hesitation before every invitation, in the way his eyes searched a room for approval before they ever searched it for her. When the invitation to the autumn gala arrived, thick cream cardstock embossed with gold lettering, Amara held it in her hands for a long, quiet moment before smiling at her husband across the kitchen table. "It has been a long time since we went to something together," she said, her voice carrying the particular hope that comes only from someone who still believes, against mounting evidence, in the person she married. Ethan barely looked up from his laptop, his fingers still moving across the keys. "We will see," he answered, and something in the flatness of those 3 words told her more than he intended it to. She did not press him. She simply folded the invitation along its original crease and set it on the counter, the way a person sets down something they already suspect will be taken from them before they ever get the chance to use it. The betrayal, when it finally arrived, came without drama, without raised voices, without the kind of confrontation that might have given Amara something solid to push against. His assistant asked for the final list of confirmed guests, scrolling through a spreadsheet on her tablet, and Ethan, glancing at his phone as though the matter were beneath his full attention, said simply, "Remove Amara's name." There was no pause before the words left his mouth, no flicker of guilt crossing his face, only the calm efficiency of a man closing a transaction he considered already settled. In her place, he added a list of names chosen for how they would photograph beside him. Investors whose faces regularly appeared in financial magazines, a minor celebrity whose attendance guaranteed coverage, a handful of people whose only real qualification was that they looked like success from across a crowded room. Amara overheard the exchange from the hallway, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, and for a long moment she did not move at all. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice or demand an explanation from the man on the other side of that door. She simply turned, walked quietly to her own study, and closed the door behind her with a stillness that was, in its own way, far more dangerous than anger could ever have been. That night, dinner passed between them in a silence so complete it seemed to carry its own weight, the kind of silence that settles into a house when 2 people are technically sitting at the same table but living, in every way that matters, in entirely different realities. Ethan ate without looking up, already rehearsing the conversations he expected to have at the gala, the deals he hoped to close, the impression he intended to leave on men whose approval he had spent his entire adult life chasing. Amara sat across from him that night, her mind traveling somewhere he could no longer follow, back to years he had conveniently allowed himself to forget in the comfort of his newer, more successful life. She remembered the apartment with the radiator that never quite worked, the winters when she took on 3 separate jobs, so that Ethan could finish his graduate degree without the burden of rent hanging constantly over his head. She remembered typing his business school applications late into the night after her own long shifts had ended. Remembered believing, with the kind of certainty only young love can produce, that she was investing in a future they would build side by side, not a stage from which she would eventually and quietly be removed. She remembered, too, the early years of the company, the nights she sat awake with him while he panicked over payroll, the meals she skipped, so he would not have to know how close to broke they truly were. None of that history had disappeared. It had simply been filed away by her husband, under the heading of things no longer relevant to the man he had since become. What Ethan did not know, what he had never once thought to ask in 8 years of marriage, was that his wife was not simply the woman who had supported him while he built his career from nothing. Amara was, in circles far beyond his own understanding, a name that opened doors he could not have imagined existed. International calls arrived on her phone, at strange and inconvenient hours, voices speaking in careful, respectful tones, and she answered each one politely, before declining whatever request accompanied it. In the study Ethan never entered, the small room she had claimed for herself the year they moved into the townhouse, there were commendations framed in simple black wood, letters of gratitude from organizations whose names occasionally appeared in the pages of serious newspapers, awards whose engravings Ethan had never once paused to read on his way past the door. He had walked by that room 1,000 times without a flicker of curiosity, assuming, as men sometimes do about the quiet people standing beside them, that there was simply nothing there worth discovering. One evening, not long before the gala, a call came through that Amara took in the privacy of that study, the voice on the other end warm, with the particular respect reserved for people whose work speaks entirely for itself. Dr. Johnson, the voice said, we would be honored if you would consider speaking at this year's gala. It would mean a great deal to the organization and to everyone who has followed your work over the years. Amara listened carefully, thanked the caller with genuine warmth, and declined, just as she had declined nearly every similar request for years, preferring the quiet architecture of her actual work to the spotlight that so often distorted it beyond recognition. She had built her life around influence without exposure, choosing substance over spectacle in a world that so often rewarded the opposite, and she had done so long before she ever met the man who now could not be bothered to invite her to a single party. There were other calls, too, over the years, calls from foundation directors and university deans and heads of nonprofit boards, each one asking, in their own careful language, for Amara to step forward and let her name be known publicly, to let the world see the architect behind so much quiet, meaningful change. Each time, she declined with the same gentle firmness, explaining that her work did not require an audience in order to matter, that she had watched enough public figures lose the substance of their mission, the moment they gained a following, to know she preferred the alternative. What she never explained, not even to the people closest to her, was that part of her reluctance came from a quieter, more personal calculation, a hope that if she remained invisible in that particular world, her husband would never have to feel the discomfort of standing beside someone whose accomplishments might outshine his own. She had, without ever admitting it to herself in those words, been protecting Ethan's fragile sense of importance for years, long before he ever asked her to disappear from a guest list. It was, perhaps, the cruelest irony of the entire story, that the very silence she kept to shield his pride was the same silence he eventually used as evidence that she did not belong beside him. Long before any of this, back when Ethan was still a young man with more debt than direction, he had met Amara in a crowded coffee shop near a university library, both of them exhausted from jobs that paid little and demanded much. She had noticed him first, actually, drawn to the quiet intensity with which he studied a spreadsheet of numbers that clearly did not yet add up in his favor, and she had offered, half as a joke, to help him find the error. He never forgot that afternoon, the way she had pulled his laptop toward herself without asking permission, the way she had found his mistake in under a minute, and handed the machine back with a small, knowing smile that suggested she was used to being underestimated, and rather enjoyed proving people wrong. In those early years, before the company existed, before the townhouse and the galas and the shareholders, they had built something between them that felt, at the time, indestructible, a partnership founded on nothing but shared ambition and genuine respect for one another's minds. It was strange, he would later think, how thoroughly a person could forget the very foundation upon which everything else had been built, simply because the view from the top made the ground below seem irrelevant. Colleagues who worked closely with Ethan during those early years often remembered Amara fondly, recalling how she would appear at the office some evenings with takeout containers balanced in her arms, feeding a team of exhausted young analysts who could not otherwise afford dinner, never once asking for credit or recognition for the gesture. She had been, by every honest account, as invested in the company's survival as Ethan himself, staying up through the same anxious nights, celebrating the same small victories with the same private joy. But somewhere between the first successful funding round and the day Ethan signed the lease on their townhouse, a quiet erosion had begun, so gradual that neither of them fully noticed it happening in real time. He began attending events without mentioning them until afterward. He began describing his achievements using only the word I, where once he had always said we. Amara noticed the shift long before he did, though she chose, for years, to attribute it to stress rather than to something closer to the truth, because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting that the man she had built a life with was slowly becoming someone else. The night of the gala arrived, dressed in its own kind of ceremony, black town cars pulling up one after another along the avenue, women in gowns that cost more than most people earned in an entire year, men greeting one another with the practiced warmth of people who each need something from the other. Ethan moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this exact performance countless times before, flanked by shareholders and analysts, his laughter calibrated precisely to the size of whichever deal he was hoping to close before the night ended. And again, as it always seemed to happen, the question arrived from someone at his elbow. "Where is your wife tonight?" Ethan smiled the same practiced smile he always wore for this particular question. "She's busy," he said, and felt beneath the words an unmistakable and shameful relief, the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally arranged his life exactly as he wanted it arranged. Tonight, he told himself, watching the room fill with exactly the kind of people he wanted watching him would be perfect, and nothing would stand between him and the version of himself he had worked so hard to construct. The evening moved through its expected rhythms. Speeches about generosity, delivered by men who rarely thought about the causes they were funding, the soft clink of glasses raised in toasts, the low hum of conversation about markets and mergers disguised carefully as small talk between old friends. Ethan drifted from circle to circle, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that were not particularly funny, filing away names and faces the way he filed away everything else in his life, according to their usefulness. And then, the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone at the front of the ballroom, his voice carrying easily over the crowd. "Tonight," he announced, "we have one final honored guest to welcome, someone whose work has touched more lives in this very room than any of us fully realize." No name followed the announcement, only a pause deliberate enough to draw every eye toward the entrance, and in that pause, the entire room seemed to hold its breath together, waiting for whatever was coming next. Every head in the ballroom turned at once, the way a single current moves through still water, and the doors at the far end of the room opened onto the cool night air beyond them. Amara stepped through, and she was not dressed for spectacle. Her gown was simple, black, unadorned by the kind of jewelry that usually announced wealth before a person had said a single word. But there was something in the way she carried herself, an unmistakable gravity that made the simplicity itself feel like power in a room otherwise drowning in excess. She did not rush. She did not search the crowd for her husband's face. She simply walked forward, and the room seemed to rearrange itself around her presence the way iron filings arrange themselves around a magnet, without anyone quite understanding why, until it had already happened around them. What followed happened almost too quickly for Ethan's mind to fully process. A former president of the United States rose from his seat near the front of the room, his hand already extended in greeting before he had even fully stood. Beside him, a technology billionaire, whose net worth appeared regularly in financial headlines, stood as well. Followed a moment later by the chairman of one of the largest global foundations in the world, a man whose signature alone could redirect the fate of entire nations struggling under crushing debt. They did not rise for Ethan, though he stood only a few feet away, frozen, his champagne glass suspended halfway to his lips as though time itself had stopped moving around him. They rose, each of them in turn, walking toward the woman he had erased from his own guest list only days before, extending their hands toward her with a warmth and reverence that made the blood drain slowly from his face. Ethan Carter, who had spent his entire adult life orchestrating rooms so that every eye would eventually land on him, stood in the center of the single most important room of his career and understood, for the very first time, that he had become entirely invisible inside it. And then he heard it, carried across the ballroom on the master of ceremonies' voice, amplified so that even the servers standing near the kitchen doors could hear it clearly from across the room. "Dr. Amara Johnson." The words landed on Ethan like a verdict delivered in a language he had somehow never bothered to learn, though he had been married to its meaning for 8 full years, without ever once asking the right questions. The introduction that followed unfolded like a biography Ethan had somehow never read, though its subject had shared his bed every single night for nearly a decade. Amara, the master of ceremonies, explained, was a renowned scholar whose research had shaped policy conversations on 3 separate continents, a trusted advisor to international organizations whose names appeared in the news whenever the world's most complicated problems required careful, patient solving. She had founded a scholarship fund, now valued in the billions of dollars, quietly redirecting fortunes towards students who might otherwise never have left the neighborhoods they were born into. For years, she had declined nearly every request for public recognition, choosing instead to let her work speak in rooms far from any camera, so thoroughly private that even people who followed such circles closely had never once seen her face attached to her name. Ethan had never asked. Not once, in 8 years, had he wondered aloud what occupied the many hours his wife spent, traveling, working, speaking quietly into a phone behind a closed door late at night. He remembered, standing frozen in that ballroom, while the applause rose around him, the countless trips she had taken over the years, the early flights, the late returns, the exhaustion carved into her eyes that he had never once paused to ask about. He had told himself, each and every time, that she was attending some minor conference, some obligation too small to require his curiosity, and he had returned to his own concerns, without a second thought crossing his mind. The truth, he now understood with a nausea that settled somewhere beneath his ribs, was an entire life he had simply chosen not to see. A woman whose influence quietly rivaled his own and, in rooms exactly like this one, surpassed it entirely, without her ever needing to say so. The applause for Amara's introduction had not even fully settled when she made her way toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, her steps unhurried, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who has spoken in far more difficult rooms than this one. She did not glance toward Ethan as she passed the table where he stood. She did not need to. When she reached the microphone, she did not open with gratitude or the practiced humility so many speakers use to soften a room before delivering their real message. She simply looked out over the crowd, allowed the silence to settle fully into every corner of the room, and spoke in a voice that was calm, measured, and entirely without anger in it. The most painful thing, she said, is not being underestimated by strangers. Strangers, after all, owe you nothing, and their misjudgments cost you very little in the end. The most painful thing is discovering that the person who is supposed to know you best, the person who promised to stand beside you through everything life would bring, has instead decided you are something to be hidden away. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture toward her husband, did not need to name him at all, because every person in that ballroom who had ever asked Ethan where his wife was already understood exactly whose story she was telling them tonight. The room, which moments earlier had buzzed with the low music of 100 private conversations, fell into a silence so complete that the clink of a single dropped fork somewhere near the back rang out like a gunshot across the marble floor. Heads turned, slowly and almost involuntarily, toward Ethan, who stood motionless near the bar, his glass still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the floor because he could not bring himself to meet a single gaze in that entire room. She continued for only a few more minutes, speaking not of her husband, but of the work itself, the scholarships awarded, the students now studying in universities they once believed were closed to people like them, the quiet satisfaction of building something that outlasted any single relationship or any single room full of applause. But the line about being hidden had already done its work, moving through the crowd, like a current, and by the time Amara stepped away from the microphone to a standing ovation, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something far more significant than a simple speech. They had watched a woman reclaim, in a matter of minutes, everything a careless husband had spent years trying to take from her without ever once naming what he was doing. When the gala finally ended, the ballroom emptied slowly, the orchestra packing away its instruments, the caterers clearing glasses from tables that had, only hours before, seemed to hold Ethan's entire future within their careful arrangements. He did not go home immediately. He sat alone in the back of the town car, watching the city lights blur past the window, replaying the moment those powerful men had risen to their feet, replaying the sound of his wife's voice describing a pain he had caused, without ever once believing himself capable of causing it. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan Carter felt genuinely, thoroughly small, and the feeling frightened him far more than any market crash or failed deal ever had in his career. When he finally arrived home, the townhouse stood dark except for a single light glowing beneath the door of Amara's study. The room he had passed 1,000 times without curiosity. That night, for the first time in 8 years of marriage, he opened that door and stepped inside. What he found there undid something in him that he had spent years carefully reinforcing against exactly this kind of collapse. Letters of gratitude lined one shelf, written by people whose lives had been altered by scholarships Amara had quietly funded and never once mentioned at their own dinner table. International commendations hung in simple frames along the far wall, awards from organizations whose work touched millions of lives, none of them displayed for guests, because Amara had never once brought a single guest into this room to see them. A photograph, tucked carefully into the corner of her desk, showed her standing at a podium inside the United Nations, delivering remarks Ethan had never known she had given, her expression steady in a way he now recognized as the very same composure she carried into every room, including their kitchen, including the marriage he had so carelessly neglected. And then he found the letters, older ones, written in handwriting he recognized instantly from the earliest years of their relationship, folded carefully inside a drawer, as though they had been kept, not for sentiment, but for safekeeping against some future need. They were letters Amara had written to herself during the years he was building his company from nothing, notes of encouragement meant to carry her through exhaustion, on nights when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing. Every single one of them, without exception, spoke of him. They spoke of his potential, his exhaustion after long nights of work, his fear of failing in front of investors who barely knew his name, his small victories that she had celebrated quietly because he had been too consumed by ambition to notice the celebration was even happening around him. Nowhere in those pages did she write about herself, about the achievements quietly piling up in organizations across the world, about the recognition she was declining year after year, so that his story could remain the only one that mattered inside their shared life together. Ethan sat on the floor of that study, surrounded by a decade of his wife's unspoken sacrifices, and wept in a way he had not allowed himself to do since he was a boy standing in a kitchen, far smaller than the one he now owned. He thought of every dinner where he had answered for her, every event where he had decided, unilaterally and without a second thought, that she did not belong beside him. He thought of the calls she had quietly declined, the recognition she had turned away, not because she lacked ambition, but because she had chosen, deliberately, to let his ambition occupy the center of their shared story. And he understood, sitting there among the evidence of a life he had never bothered to learn, that he had not simply embarrassed his wife in front of powerful strangers. He had spent 8 years failing to see the extraordinary person who had been standing beside him the entire time, choosing instead to measure her worth by how she might appear beside him, rather than by everything she actually was. The weeks that followed were not marked by grand gestures or dramatic apologies, because Ethan understood, finally and completely, that grand gestures were exactly the kind of performance that had broken things between them in the first place. He began declining meetings he would once have prioritized above almost anything else in his life, canceling dinners with investors who had, until recently, defined the entire shape of his calendar and his sense of self-worth. He sought Amara out not with demands for forgiveness, but with something quieter, something closer to patience than to persuasion. He did not ask her to come back to him, not at first, understanding that such a request would only repeat the same old pattern of centering his own needs above everything else. He asked only for the chance to become, slowly and without expectation of reward, the kind of man she had once believed him to be, back when believing in him had cost her 3 jobs and countless sleepless nights spent worrying over his future rather than her own. Amara did not answer him right away. She let the silence stretch across days, then weeks, watching carefully to see whether his change would survive contact with the ordinary friction of daily life, or whether it would dissolve quietly the moment the shame of that night faded from memory. As so many resolutions eventually do, she had heard promises before, in smaller forms, promises to be more present, to ask more questions, promises that had always evaporated the moment his attention returned to whatever deal was closing that quarter. She was not interested in words this time. She had spent 8 years listening to words. What she wanted now, if she wanted anything at all from him, was evidence, sustained over enough time that it could no longer be mistaken for a performance staged for an audience of one. He did not try to convince her with words after that first request, understanding instinctively that words had never been the currency in which real trust was purchased between two people who actually knew each other. Instead, he showed up in the small, unglamorous ways he had once considered beneath his attention, driving her to meetings she had never asked him to attend, sitting quietly in the back of rooms where her work unfolded without fanfare, learning for the first time the actual shape of the life she had built beside his own, without ever once asking him to notice it. He read, finally, every letter and commendation in that study, not out of obligation, but because he wanted, for the first time in years, to know the person he had married, rather than simply the person he had assumed she was based on convenience and habit. He learned the names of the students her scholarships had helped, learned the histories of the organizations she quietly advised, learned, slowly and humbly, that his wife's life was not a subplot running quietly beneath his own, but an entire story he had never bothered to open. There was a particular afternoon, several months into that quiet, patient rebuilding, when Ethan sat in the back row of a small auditorium at a public university, watching Amara address a room of first-generation students receiving scholarships from the fund she had built. He had asked to come, and she had allowed it without much comment, uncertain what to expect from a man who had spent years treating such moments as beneath his calendar. He listened as she spoke, without notes, answering questions from nervous 18-year-olds who could barely believe someone like her was standing in front of them, and he understood, watching her, that this was the woman he had married, fully realized, doing exactly the work she had always been meant to do, work she had done for years, while he assumed she was simply away at some minor conference. He did not interrupt. He did not seek out the event organizer afterward to have his own presence noted. He simply stayed until the last student had left the room, and then he drove her home in a silence that, for the first time in a long while, felt companionable rather than cold. He also began correcting the record in smaller, less visible ways that no one but Amara would ever fully notice or appreciate. When old colleagues asked how the company had survived its earliest, most precarious years, Ethan stopped crediting his own instincts alone and started mentioning, plainly and without prompting, the woman who had worked 3 jobs so he could finish his degree, the woman who had fed his exhausted team out of her own modest paycheck, the woman whose quiet sacrifices had made every subsequent success possible. It cost him something, admitting this out loud to men who valued only strength and certainty, but he had come to understand that the version of strength he once performed for them was hollow compared to the truth he now chose to tell instead. Slowly, without announcement, the distance between them began to close, not because Amara forgot what he had done, but because he proved, through the patient accumulation of ordinary days, that he had genuinely changed the man standing inside himself. There were setbacks along the way, moments where old habits surfaced, and he caught himself once again editing her out of a conversation before catching the mistake and correcting it aloud in front of whoever happened to be listening. There were evenings when Amara still chose distance over closeness, unwilling to rush toward a reconciliation she was not yet certain would hold. But season by season, the pattern shifted, and the man who had once erased his wife's name from a guest list without a second thought became, gradually, a man who spoke her name in rooms where she was not even present, correcting people gently when they assumed, as strangers often did, that his success belonged to him alone. A year passed, carrying the city through another winter and back around into another autumn, and another gala arrived, hosted in the same ballroom, beneath the same chandeliers that had once witnessed Ethan's public unraveling in front of everyone who mattered to his career. This time, when the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone, he did not need a dramatic pause to draw the room's attention, because everyone in that ballroom already knew the name he was about to say before he said it. "Please welcome Dr. Amara Johnson," he announced. And the room rose to its feet in genuine, unhesitating applause before she had even fully crossed the threshold into view. When the doors opened this time, Ethan was already standing there waiting, not ahead of her, not beside her in the way that suggested ownership, but simply present, his hand extended not to lead her forward, but to walk alongside her into a room that had once made him feel he had to choose between his ambition and his marriage. He did not step in front of her as she moved through the crowd that gathered to greet her. He did not angle himself toward the cameras that occasionally flashed near the entrance, no longer needing to be seen in order to feel that the evening belonged to him. When it came time for him to speak, invited briefly to the podium by an organizer who remembered the story from the year before, Ethan kept his remarks short, his voice steady in a way that had nothing left to prove to anyone in that room. "Tonight," he said, looking not at the crowd, but directly at his wife standing near the edge of the stage, "I want everyone here to know something I should have said publicly a long time ago, long before I ever needed a room full of strangers to teach me its truth. The most extraordinary person in my life is not the one standing behind a podium giving speeches about markets or growth projections or quarterly earnings. It is my wife, and I spent years too foolish, too afraid, and too consumed by my own image to admit that simple truth out loud, even to myself." The applause that followed did not belong to Ethan, and he understood that completely as he stepped away from the microphone and returned to stand quietly beside her. It belonged to a woman who had chosen dignity over bitterness, when bitterness would have been the far easier, far more understandable path to take. And it belonged to the quiet, hard-won proof that a man who once tried to hide the person he loved had finally learned that love cannot survive being kept in the shadows of someone else's ambition. Some lessons, the room seemed to understand together in that shared moment, arrive only after everything nearly falls apart beyond repair, and the rarest lessons of all are the ones a person remains humble enough to actually learn from, rather than simply survive. Outside, the autumn air had turned colder still, and the city moved on around them exactly as it always had, indifferent to the small, private transformations happening inside its grandest ballrooms. But for two people, standing near the edge of a stage, holding hands in front of a room that had once watched one of them fall apart in public, something had genuinely shifted, quietly and permanently, in the architecture of an 8-year marriage. Amara had not forgotten the pain of that first gala, and she never fully would, because forgetting was never the point of what she had chosen to do. What she had chosen instead was to give a changed man the room to prove himself worthy of a second chance he had not earned through words but through years of consistent, unglamorous, deliberate action. And Ethan, standing beside her as the orchestra began to play once more, finally understood the difference between being married to someone and actually knowing them, a difference that had cost him nearly everything before he learned, at last, to close it. People who witnessed both galas, a year apart in the same room, would sometimes say afterward that the story felt almost too neatly resolved to be entirely true, the kind of ending that seems designed rather than lived. But those who knew the couple more closely understood that nothing about the year in between had been neat at all, that it had been built from 1,000 small, unremarkable choices, apologies offered without excuses, patience extended without guarantee of reward, and a woman's quiet decision to give a changed man room, to prove it, rather than dismissing him the moment his character was finally tested. Amara never once used that first gala as a weapon against Ethan in the months that followed, never brought it up to wound him further than the truth already had, because she understood, better than most, that real change requires the possibility of being believed, not merely punished. And Ethan never again forgot, in any room he entered for the rest of his life, that the woman beside him had never needed his permission to matter, only his attention, and that the cost of failing to give it, even to someone who loves you without condition, can very nearly be everything.